2, 3, bang.
Yes, it's absolutely right. I bought every single version of the M4 MacBook Airs, so you don't have to. I had a few questions in mind, like what are some of the colors actually like in real life? Should I upgrade my CPU, RAM, GPU? And are these hundreds of dollars of upgrades actually worth it? And after testing them all, I can confidently tell you the answer. And then I actually realized that there's certain options for Apple that you should never buy because it makes 0 sense and is just a waste of money. In fact, I was actually surprised by the results, and I also found out one of the biggest flaws that MacBook Airs have that might make you want to consider the Pro laptops. Let's start. This video is brought to you by us. Yes, I paid myself to tell you that why don't you go also check out our work from home ultimate setup makeover. I had great fun making this video. It was a great time where we could use some very different, interesting products and actually give it to a person to use. Also, we used a very interesting PC there, 100% silent at 100% time, even at full load. If you don't know what I'm talking about, the links are in the description below. Go check it out. By the way, if you do want to pick up any of these MacBook Airs, I've left the links in the description below, and those links are actually cheaper than what Apple sells them on their home website. So if you want to save a little bit of money, go check them out. They are affiliate links though, so I do get a small commission, but at no extra cost to you. So let's talk about the price first. Now the base model is $999. That is very, very good, and in fact cheaper than what it previously has been. And I was wondering, how did Apple actually do that? And the base model for me is this sky blue one over here. And I discovered something very interesting. When looking underneath the sky blue laptop, you can see that tiny little text over there that actually says designed by Apple in California, but assembled in Vietnam. Any other configuration apart from the base model is not assembled in Vietnam. All the rest of the laptops have assembled in China, and that's a clever way how you can remove the 10% import tax. I believe that's 10%, and if you consider 10% import tax actually on there, then you can see that that's exactly why they removed that price from the MacBook, and now it's $100 cheaper, which is amazing, and you get more RAM with it and all that. By the way, if you're considering upgrading the laptop's charger from Apple's website and thinking about getting the $70 charger for $20, I wouldn't recommend that. I'll left some links in the description below where you can actually get a smaller charger or more powerful charger with more ports for about the same price. So I feel like Apple's not the best option in there. I left some in the description below as well, so go check them out if you want. There's a few options, some very small ones, some a little bit bigger ones that have more power, so you can charge them even more, or even if you have a MacBook Pro or something like that, you can pick them up or charge some other devices with it as well, because the one that Apple has only has one USB-C port. So then let's take a look at the colors. There are 4 different colors. We've got the sky blue, that's the new color that's come out. That's the base model for me. Then we've got the silver, which is the classic silver from Apple. Really nice. Then we have the Starlight, which is kind of a silver, but a little bit of a golden kind of sandy tone, a little bit beige to it. Not like fully gold, but that's a little bit there. And then finally, we have the Midnight Blue. Now, this is very dark blue. It might look a little bit black to you, but if I pull my MacBook Pro next to it, you can really see that it is blue. To me, there are 2 models that are really, really nice and that I would go for. The Midnight, which is the dark one, and then the silver one. These are the classy ones, and I feel like, I don't know, as a man, I probably prefer these more than the Starlight or the Sky Blue, but my wife was like, she likes the blue one the most, so hey, there's something for everybody, I guess. But for me, why I like the silver and the black the most is that the black one kind of gets you this perception that you've got the Pro model, because only the Pro models can come in the black and like dark, you know, matte black version, which this kind of is like, ooh, what type of MacBook are you running? So you kind of, you know, look better than you actually are. But then the silver one is also the classic one, and not like so different color variants, that this could be the Pro version as well. So you can kind of get away with it. But I really love this silvery classic tone of this one. Like, these 2 are my favorite. Let me know which one is yours. Now, they all come with also like their kind of color matched charger, but these are very, very hard to tell the difference which ones are which. I almost put them in the wrong place. Now, the blue one is very slightly blue in here, and you can see this next to this white on that side. And then this is kind of the starlight color, which has got slight beige to this tone. And then you've got the black or like dark blue one. To me, the silver one looks the nicest because the dark blue one, as you can see, even from here, I've got a lot of fingerprints on it. It's a big fingerprint magnet, actually a lot more than the MacBook Pro. So, because I think they don't have the special coating on it. So let's talk about the CPU performance and GPU performance and SSD performance. Are some of these upgrades actually worth it? So which configurations did I buy? I already mentioned that the Sky Blue is the base model. So that's where the GPU and CPU are the base, which means 10-core CPU and 8-core GPU. The RAM is 16 gigabytes and 256 gigabytes of storage. Then we've got the silver one over here, and this one has the 24 gigabytes of RAM. And when you upgrade the RAM, you also get the upgrade of the CPU. So the CPU and GPU now are both 10 cores because it's the one chip, even though the GPU is the one that gets upgraded. 2 extra cores of the GPU, but 24 gigabytes of RAM and still 256 gigs of storage. I didn't want to upgrade the storage, every one of them, because it's expensive. Then we've got this Starlight one that has 32 gigabytes of RAM, 256 gigs of storage. And then because you upgraded the RAM, you also get the GPU upgrade. So 10 core GPU and CPU. Then finally, we have this guy on here, the Midnight one, which has 10-core CPU, 10-core GPU, 16 gigs of RAM, but 512 gigabytes of storage. So the storage is now upgraded. Wondering, is the storage going to get faster when you have those? So we have all the RAM configurations and then one storage configuration to see what's actually happened there. So firstly, let's take a look at CPU performance. This is Cinebench R24, and what you've seen here is the single core and the multi-core score. Single core means how fast is the laptop doing single tasks. So when you're opening programs, when you're doing some single tasks on the browser, you're working with some of the documents, or you're opening photos, or even editing photos, is often very single core or single threaded task. But then the multi-core task is something when you're doing something very heavy, like a Blender render, or you're rendering something, or you're putting video together, or you're exporting something. That's when all of the cores on the PC are working together. How does that work? Then I've got a 10-minute multi-core score and then a 30-minute multi-core score. That will show us how good is the performance in extended time. If we run the multi-core loads 10 minutes, is it going to go down? If we run it for 30 minutes, is it going to go further down? Because all of these MacBooks are passively cooled. There's no fan in there, which means that are we able to keep the load up in 10 minutes, 30 minutes? How much are we going to lose? Very interesting configurations there. So then we've got the base model, which is going to be the base for all of them, 24 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, and then 16 gigabytes on top, as all of these different models compare to each other. So what we can see here is the 24 gigabyte model. When we upgrade the RAM, there's a couple of percent difference in all of the scores, kind of goes better, which basically means there's no real difference on the CPU in just pure CPU performance. I would consider 2-3% within margin of error, but it is still better. Now, it also could be because of the ambient temperature. If my ambient temperature is a couple of degrees warmer, the laptop warms up quicker, which means that it has to pull down the wattage, faster. So the base model maybe was a little bit warmer, and that's why we're getting a difference. If you look at the 32 gigabytes model, you think, okay, more RAM here on the Starlight, and we would get better performance. But if you look at the actual 10 minutes performance, it is 6.5% slower than the base model, because I had already done something on the chassis, and suddenly we're getting 6-7% lower performance. But then on the 30 minutes, yet when I was testing it, the ambient was very, very lower temperature. And suddenly we're getting 11 to 12% faster performance than on the base model, because the ambient or chassis temperature was a lot cooler. So it massively depends what is your chassis and ambient temperature. If you're doing the test when you've already worked with the laptop, you're gonna get different scores. But then also when you work on like a completely cool laptop and then do a video export in a very cool outside -degrees, it's gonna can export it significantly faster. And you can see that on the 16 gigabyte on this black version here, where you can see that the SSD upgrade doesn't really make a difference on the CPU, but the 30-minute one is 14% faster than the base model, because I was doing it in a cooler ambient temperature. That is a massive, massive difference. So this is one of the first things that we're established here looking at the CPU performance is it massively depends what type of environment are you in. I'm in the north of England, okay? It's a lot cooler than you guys maybe watching this from Las Vegas or California, where we've got a lot warmer outside temperature or maybe even ambient temperature. Your MacBooks might just be lower in performance just because it's warmer for you, which is the interesting quirk here. Let's move on to Geekbench 6. We can see that the 24 gigabytes doesn't have any performance difference really compared to the base model. The 32 gigabyte RAM upgrade, again, exactly the same. The SSD upgrade seems to have a little bit faster single core performance, but again, I would put it within margin of error. So we can see that in a test, really when they're all the same, Geekbench 6 is not as stressing as Cinebench on the CPU. They basically perform all the same regardless of the RAM upgrade. Then moving on to iGPU, let's test the GPUs. I want to know if the GPU upgrade actually made a difference. So the base model with 2 cores less than 24, 32, and later all the rest of them have the GPU upgrades. And we can see when you upgrade the GPU, you're roughly getting about 13, 14 to 16, 17% increase in OpenCL and Metal scores. So any upgrade you're going to do, you're going to get the GPU upgrade, you're going to get roughly, 10 to 15% kind of increase in GPU performance. Looking at the AI difference, if you upgrade the RAM, really, I'm not seeing any difference on the CPU. 24 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, exactly the same. Even when upgrading the SSD, the CPU AI performance doesn't change at all. But moving on to the AI performance on the GPU, we can see when having extra cores on the GPU, we're getting 10 to 12% on the 24 gigabytes, but then the 32 gigabyte one gets even bigger increase. We can see up to 15.3% increase in the single GPU score. So maybe it's because it can utilize a lot more of the RAM because it's a unified memory. Some of the VRAM can be used for GPU. It's a little bit better in there. But then going back to the 512 gigabyte SSD upgrade, but it's still the base model RAM, we see still 10 to 12% increase in the GPU there. So again, upgrading the GPU, you'll see increase in AI as well. What about the NPU? The AI NPU performance across the board, really no difference. They're all within 1% of each other. So really that doesn't change anything whether you upgrade RAM, SSD, GPU, it's all the same. But what about some creator benchmarks now? Adobe Photoshop. Moving on to 24 gigabytes, so where we get a little bit more GPU and then more RAM, we're getting 5 to 7.8% increase in performance, which is actually pretty good. Moving on to more RAM, to 32 gigabytes of RAM, we're getting even more performance. 7.5 to roughly about 12% increase in performance. That is a huge thing. And when we upgrade the actual SSD, which means that the GPU gets upgraded, we still get a little bit of a boost in the performance. In overall scores, roughly about 3%, but then the filter score up to 4.6%. So what does this actually mean here? It means that our Photoshop benchmark has a RAM bottleneck. That means that we need to use more RAM than is available for the base model of the system. And that is most likely true for you if you're working in Photoshop. If you have 16 gigabytes, yes, you can get away with it, but it has to swap a lot with the SSD. It has to shift a lot of the things to the SSD and then back to the RAM if it needs to do that. Now, macOS is very good at doing that, but if you had more RAM, you get extra 5% performance in there. If you had even more RAM, as you can see, 32 gigabytes, 8% increase. Now that is a $400 upgrade on RAM, but you do get more performance increase there. Now a GPU upgrade, if you upgraded the GPU, you do get a couple of percent increase in there, but not as much as upgrading the RAM. This is the massive bottleneck there. So if you plan to use a lot of Photoshop for your MacBook Airs, upgrading the RAM will be worth it because you will be using more than 16 gigabytes of it, especially if you have other things open. Now I'm testing them where nothing else is open. Maybe a Chrome is open with 1-2 tabs, but if you've got other programs open, it might be even bigger performance hit for you. So bear that in mind when working with photos, whether it's Photoshop or Lightroom Classic, it's exactly the same. Moving on to video editing, and here I've got Premiere Pro, Adobe program that is probably not as efficient as you might think, Final Cut or DaVinci Resolve is, which we'll look at in a minute. Moving on to 24 gigabytes, as you can see, we're getting 11% lower performance than on the base model. I was like, what on earth is going on in here?
So upgrading the RAM and getting better GPU, we're actually getting lower performance, which kind of doesn't make any sense in here. So how can this be? Why do we get lower performance with upgraded RAM and GPU? Well, here again, you can see that having a hotter chassis makes a huge difference. Now, upgrading of this seems to be not as big of a deal as just running them cooler. Cooling makes a huge difference here, and even though it should be faster with the better GPU and better, more RAM, because it will use more than 16 gigabytes when running this, cooling the laptop down is a huge thing. Moving on to 32 gigabytes, as you can see, we do get a little bit of a better performance there on the GPU effects because we've got more VRAM, because more RAM in here is more VRAM as well, basically. And then the raw scores, they're a couple of percent better, but generally within the same margin there, even though we've got more RAM. Now, moving on to the SSD upgrade, you can see we're roughly around the same kind of performance in all of them as the base model. So here, interestingly, seems like cooling the laptop is a lot bigger of an issue rather than having more RAM and upgrading that. Now, having more RAM, it actually will make a difference, even though this benchmark is very efficient in utilizing the 16 gigabytes on the base and then double the RAM. It doesn't make that much of a difference. But in real world, when you're exporting or when you're doing stuff, having more RAM does make actually a difference. Now, the best example for this is when I tested my MacBook Pro M4 Max with base amount of RAM and then 128 gigabytes of RAM. You could see that having more RAM in there, it did make a difference. Just this benchmark, Geekbench for this Premiere Pro, is very efficient of it. So depending how heavy you want to be on the video editing, more RAM will kind of give you better performance. But at that point, I'm kind of telling you, maybe you should consider the Pro version if you're doing more video editing, because kind of doesn't make sense spending that much on the upgrade on the MacBook Air. Because if you go with a Pro model, the same amount of upgrade, $200, will give you more RAM, for example, than on the MacBook Air. On MacBook Air upgrades, you get less, whereas on the Pro version, you get more for your upgrade money, if that makes sense. Go check it out. Let's move on to DaVinci Resolve. And here, interestingly, when upgrading the RAM and getting a little GPU increase, we can get 10% increase in performance. If you look at Fusion scores, they are 34% faster. That is a huge performance increase, because DaVinci Resolve, what we've seen on the PC as well, loves to use a lot of VRAM, video memory. But now in this case, the actual memory is also video memory and system memory on all of it together. So it does make a huge difference there. Interestingly, when moving on to 32 gigabytes, shows us that we're not getting a massive increase in performance over the 24 gigabytes, probably again because of our ambient or chassis temperature. That is a bigger issue here, but still compared to the Fusion scores, we're 20 plus kind of percent faster there. So when having more and you plan to do a lot of DaVinci Resolve, that will help you in there. Having an SSD upgrade doesn't give you that much of a performance increase. You can see that it's kind of within margin of error. So here that doesn't make a difference. Having extra GPU cores there though, that's the one that makes a, you give 1, 2, 3% increase. So upgrading the GPU, I would say not as much worth it as going with the 24 gigabytes of RAM. Here, just a conclusion in DaVinci Resolve, when upgrading the RAM to 24 gigabytes, you also get the GPU upgrade. So paying just for a GPU upgrade is kind of not worth it for me. Paying for a RAM upgrade is worth it because you also get the $100 GPU upgrade. Moving on to CPU now here. And this is a Blender benchmark. We're testing the CPU, and all of these guys really perform exactly the same. Like within 1-2% of each other, doesn't make any difference in there. But what about a GPU? When having the base model with 8-core GPU or more, then doesn't make that big of a difference. Yes, the 10 cores is kind of 3.5% faster in the classroom scene on the 24 gigabytes and about 1.4% faster in the monster scene, but that is not a huge difference here, because in the junk shop scene, we're kind of 8% slower, and we can see that as well. Interestingly, the base model seems to perform better on the junk shop scene. Almost feels like, what's going on there? How is this an error there? So I don't see that much of a difference in Blender, which utilizes the GPU. Having more cores kind of doesn't make any sense in here. Moving on to speedometer, so that is a browser test where we're seeing if having more RAM kind of increases your browser testing. Not real difference here, absolutely exactly the same. What about Redshift though? Another GPU rendering engine. we can see that having more cores here makes a massive difference. Interestingly, not as much in Blender or Geekbench. Well, Geekbench, we got like a 10% or a little bit in there. But in here, having more VRAM and more GPU scores, 25 to 30% almost increase in there. That is absolutely massive. Now, upgrading the GPU even more to 10 cores, we see even bigger increase, about 26% there, but then the 30 minutes, we're getting a little bit more because you can use a little bit VRAM, or also we had a massively cooler ambient temperature, chassis temperature. You can see we got extra 15% difference just because the laptop was cooler. Just because of the ambient or chassis temperature, over 15% difference. That is huge. And as you can see, if we upgrade just the GPU without any RAM, so the RAM configuration is the same, but the GPU now is 10 cores, we can see about 8.4% faster in the single GPU score, but then about 27% faster in the actual 30-minute score there. So again, 30 minutes, having cooler temperature, 27% faster because of little upgrade performance. You can see around the same 15-20% we're getting extra just because it's cooler. So GPU and CPU performance conclusion here is, yes, upgrading the RAM kind of makes a difference, especially in certain GPU tasks. You can see probably the biggest difference there. But one of the biggest difference for you, if you're really heavy on these devices, would be cooling the device down. You'd get even more performance difference. What about SSDs now? The different RAM configurations here from 16 to 24 gigabytes, a little bit faster on the SSD. Interestingly, didn't expect that. And when moving on to the 32 gigabytes, again, a little bit faster. So it looks like upgrading the RAM is slightly faster on the SSD as well. However, this works really on the hardware and operating system level, but having more RAM, it might be faster even on your SSD. I don't know if it uses your actual RAM as like a DRAM cache for your SSD when writing or reading on it. It could, and maybe having more of it makes a difference here. But when upgrading to 512 gigabytes of storage, so the storage gets twice the upgrade, we're getting 21 to 67% increase. Yes, when upgrading the storage, you will get massively faster speed for your RAM. So that was the Anamorpheus benchmark. And then we're moving on to Blackmagic disk speed test. We're seeing roughly the same. With an extra RAM, we're getting, 5% kind of performance difference, a little bit extra there. Interestingly, the 32 gigabytes of RAM is about 10% slower on the write speed. I don't know why. I did it multiple times. Still, they're seeing that. So sometimes the SSD speed may vary a little bit. I do want to say that the Blackmagic disk speed test is not as kind of constant as the Anamorpheus or the previous test, but I just want to show that to you anyway as well. But then upgrading the SSD, 67% increase. Massive increase in SSD performance when upgrading that. So yes, upgrading the SSD capacity will also make the SSD faster for you. So knowing all of this performance difference now, there is one option that you should never do on the MacBook Air. To me, do not buy the GPU upgrade. Just paying $100 for the GPU upgrade, to me, is not worth it. You shouldn't do that. Just upgrade your RAM because then you already get that one. Apple's clever. You want to pay the extra $100 to get that for free, but I wouldn't go for the GPU upgrade. I don't see any workflow where you would benefit from that. But the top of the line conclusion here is, what's the MacBook Airs like really? Number one thing is, and the biggest flaw of the MacBook Airs is the actual passive cooling. Even though part of me is a huge fan of this, when just working with these, when I've been using this, you don't really notice it. If you're just doing emails, when you're working on a browser and you just want to use it casually, you don't notice the difference and it doesn't make a difference. It's completely fine because the laptop never heats up. But when you're doing heavy works on this, it can lose quite significant amount of performance. And at that point, I would maybe say to you, that's where you might want to consider the Pro lineup because they have active cooling. You get much constant performance of this. So if you're doing any video, photo editing, probably a Pro lineup is for you. That being said, it's not that you can't do it on the MacBook Air. I just say that if that is your main workflow, you might want to upgrade. But for 99% of the people who just use this as maybe making notes, just want a very good battery life option, It's absolutely fantastic, and you know, it's incredible machine. One of my favorites there. By the way, if you do find that your MacBook Air is kind of struggling with the heat a lot, I have made a video how you can fix that yourself. All you have to do is kind of unscrew the bottom and then put a few things in there. Go check out my DIY cooling upgrade for that, because at that point, your cooling will be pretty much the same as an active cooling, but it's just a little DIY upgrade that can cost you extra $20. Definitely worth it for me, because my personal MacBook Air, the 15-inch, I'm still running this. This is fantastic upgrade for that. I don't see as much of a performance dip in that. So maybe you want to check that out. Another takeaway for me is that the 32GB RAM upgrade is an overkill for me. I don't see why you would need 32GB of RAM. The operating system is actually quite efficient. So if you're thinking about buying the extra 200 for the, 32GB upgrade from 24 to 32, I would actually use that for the SSD upgrade, because then you have more SSD capacity on the system. And even if the system swaps with your SSD, you're actually increasing the terabyte written spec because you're increasing the capacity. So that gets better, and you'd get better performance anyway. And it's a little bit better that you have to have dongles. So it is worth it going there. 32GB for the MacBook Air to me is just there as like a ridiculous upgrade, so that the 24GB kind of makes more sense for you. I don't think 32GB is a wise choice for you. If you're thinking about upgrading the storage for your MacBook Air, go check out my storage guide, how I managed to fix some of the Apple overpriced storage issues, because then you can do that as well. If you want to pick up any of these up, the links are in the description below. Thanks very much guys for watching, and bye-bye.